If you're like most podcasters, you're probably starting with the default type of question, and it's destroying your credibility and hurting your reputation. Welcome to B2B On Air. I'm your host, Joseph Lewin, and in today's episode, we're going to address the most common way that podcasters intro guests and why it's hurting you. It puts your guests in a really bad position, it bores your audience, and it makes you look like you didn't prepare. Once we go through why the default intro isn't working for you, I'm going to share with you two different ways that you can actually intro your guests that's far more effective. It builds your credibility and it builds theirs. So the type of intro that most podcasters start with is something like, tell me about your background, or tell me about why you're an expert in XYZ. Any type of question where you're putting the bio on the guest is a mistake for several reasons. The first one is that unless this is a very seasoned podcast guest, they're not going to have a good, concise answer to this question. And even if they are a seasoned guest, if you asked your question in some unique way, so you try to sound interesting, you're actually setting up even a seasoned guest for failure because they probably practice a way to share their bio very concisely for a typical intro like that. But if you flip it on them and you're asking them something really unique, but is still putting it on them to give their bio, then even a seasoned podcast guest can struggle with that. If somebody isn't a seasoned podcast guest, then you're really setting them up for failure because there's no way they're going to be able to give a really good authoritative answer in 15 seconds, which is really about as long as that bio should be. Instead, they're either going to give some really quick answer that doesn't actually share their credibility, or they're going to give an answer that's 5 minutes long of them going into their entire background and things that are completely irrelevant to the episode at hand. This does your audience a disservice because they're either not going to give this person credibility or they're going to be bored by the time it gets through the entire bio. And finally, it makes you look bad as a host because you didn't do your due diligence to figure out why this was a good guest in the first place. And if you can't tell your audience why this person is the right person for this topic, then it makes you look like you don't know what you're doing. All right, so what should you do instead? Because you've got to intro your guest. So the two ways that I've seen that are most effective are to either start with a pain point, a problem, or talk about the transformation that you know your audience wants to make. And then you take 15 to 20 seconds to summarize your guest's credibility and why they're the right person to answer this question. That could be done sometimes in 1 or 2 lines. You don't always have to go through somebody's full background. If I'm going to have somebody on my podcast to talk about podcast launches, then I'll just do it for myself because that's something that I help do. An opener could look something like this. If you're struggling to get your podcast off the ground, you're probably dealing with one of 3 common problems that almost everybody is struggling with to get their podcast off the ground. In other words, you're not alone. And the good news is there's a simple framework that can help you to launch your podcast in the next 30 days. I'm really excited to have my guest on today, Joseph Lewin. He's launched 45 B2B podcasts, and he's seen exactly where the fail points are, and they're the same with almost every podcast. Joseph, I'm really excited to have you on the show today. So you could see there, I don't know exactly how long that was, but it's probably about 15-second intro, maybe 20 seconds. I've now introduced the pain point or the problem that we're solving. I've given credibility to the guest and explained exactly why this guest is a good fit for that particular topic. And then I'm going right into saying, welcome to the show. And then the guest is probably going to say, hi, you get a little bit of pleasantry out of the way. And then I'm going to dive right in with a very relevant question that gets us way into the conversation. So now 30 to 45 seconds into the episode, the guest is already going into their area of expertise rather than that happening at the 2, 3, 4 minute mark that typically happens in guest interviews. So the other way you can do it is you can give a 30-second to 1 minute bio on the guest. I've worked with some podcast hosts that are very good at this. I'm not, so I'm not even going to give you an example here because it's not something that I typically do very good with. But what you're going to want to do in that case is you're going to pick the 3 or 4 things that are highly relevant to why this person is somebody that's credible. So if they've done something really huge in their past that gives them super high credibility, they've written a best-selling book, or they've spoken on a keynote stage somewhere, or they led the transformation of some big project at a well-known company. You start with that. Then you give the specific 2 or 3 credibility points on why they're the best person for this particular topic, and then you dive into the show. And so those are the 2 that I like the most, either starting with pain point, problem, or transformation that your audience wants to make, and then spending 1 or 2 sentences to explain why this guest is the perfect fit for that. Or you start out just straight into, this is who the guest is today. They're super smart in this area. Here's the 2 or 3 credibility points for that. And then you dive right into the episode. So either way, 30 seconds to 1 minute, you're diving right into the podcast episode. This is going to help you to make much more relevant, concise openers, leading to a more concise, focused show. It puts the guest at ease and makes them feel really pumped up to start the episode. And it positions the guest exactly how you want to with the audience. So you're able to keep the audience involved for that key first minute of your episode. So if you stop doing the default intro that's absolutely ruining the beginning of your show and focus on one of those 2 ways that you can intro your guest, you're going to have better, more concise episodes that make a stronger connection with your guest and with your audience. Thanks for tuning into this episode, and we'll see you on the next one.